So I've noticed something over my close to 40 years of living on this spinning sphere called Earth. We are really, really good and really, really interested in grace when it pertains to us. But when grace is required to be given to somebody else, we're not quite as interested, right? Like, I want grace shown to me, but I'm not really that interested whether you get grace shown to you or not, because I'm in my skin and you're in your skin, and what affects me, and what affects you, who cares? We wouldn't say it like that, but that seems to be kind of a common theme that I've discovered over the last 40 years or so. And it's not just this theory that I have. It's not just this idea that I came up with out of nowhere. It's actually a thing that has been studied in psychology since like the 1960s, at least. Probably longer than that, but documented since the 1960s. And it has a name. And the name is the fundamental, we've got a slide for it there, the fundamental attribution error. You ever heard of it before? Maybe one or two people have. If you haven't, don't worry about it, because I didn't really know about it until I started studying for this message this week. So we're all in the same boat. But then there are some of you who you knew about it, so you're a step above us. But this fundamental attribution error, essentially it is a cognitive bias that causes us to attribute someone's behavior to their character. So let me give you an example. So let's say that you have someone in your life that you know who is habitually late. Like, they are late. You tell them to get somewhere 45 minutes earlier than it actually starts, because you know they're going to get there about 30 minutes after it starts, right? I mean, you know that. When we think about someone who's late like that, this cognitive bias that some of us might be tempted to give into would say, that person's just lazy. They're disorganized. They're irresponsible. Like, that's what we would say. They're lazy, they're disorganized, they're irresponsible. But when I'm late, I never stop and look in the mirror and say, you know what your problem is? You're lazy, disorganized, and irresponsible. And my guess is neither do you. All of that seems like a no-brainer, and yet this is something that has shown up in the course of our lives for years and years and years, this cognitive bias. And I believe that it shows up sometimes the most when it comes to the political conversation. Now, taking our example from earlier when we're talking about being late constantly, if we wanted to spin that in a political conversation and those cognitive biases, here's what would probably be heard. Man, those Democrats are just horrific. They're horrible, horrible people. The reason they vote the way that they do, the reason they believe the way that they do is just because at their core, they're horrible people. Those Republicans, man, they're ridiculous. They believe the things that they believe. They vote the way that they believe because they're disgusting. Or maybe it's like this. All Democrats are socialists. I've met every single one of them. I know that they are. And they would never admit this or not, but all Republicans are racist. The thing that's really interesting is nobody stood up like, how can you say that? Because we're all kind of desensitized to it. We've heard those very same statements, haven't we? In the political realm, we hear those words, we hear those thoughts, and we just kind of brush them off. We're like, whatever. This cognitive bias that we attribute someone's stuff to their character, their imperfections to their character, it shows up so much in politics. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted to have a conversation about politics. Over the last couple of weeks, if you're just joining us online this morning, or if you've missed the last couple of weeks, we've had a conversation in the church about politics, because we believe that having a conversation in the church should be the safest place to talk about anything, politics included. And so here has been our theme for this entire series. This has been the goal that if you walk away and you don't remember anything else, this is the one thing I want you to remember. Disagree politically, love unconditionally, and pray for unity. Disagree politically, love unconditionally, and pray for unity. That's the goal. That's the thing that we're after. And so in that very first week, we talked about this concept, and we introduced this idea that Jesus, before his death and before his resurrection, he prayed a prayer. He asked the Father, he said, Lord, would you make them one? He prayed for his disciples, but not just for the disciples. He prayed for everyone who would believe in their message following. He said, Lord, would you make them one as we are one, so that the world will know, so that the world will recognize that they are my followers, and ultimately so that the world will recognize that there is a God in heaven who loves them and cares for them and wants to interact with them and be in a relationship with them. That was where we were at in week 1. In week 2, last week, we introduced this template, this idea that how can we know that there is, where unity ends and where differing opinions begin. How can we get to that place? How can we understand that? And so we introduced this phrase. We're actually going to talk about it in a little bit. The phrase is the law of Christ. Paul wrote about it in 2 of his letters that survived antiquity, that made their way into our New Testaments. And basically we said the law of Christ was his shorthand version for saying loving God the way that God through Christ has loved you. That was his shorthand. That was the law of Christ, was me loving you the way that God through Christ has loved me. And so he said that the law of Christ should actually, or this is what we said last week, the law of Christ should influence our consciences, not just as individuals, but as a whole, as a group of believers of Jesus. Essentially, regardless of where we stand politically, there should be certain things that get us upset, that we are appalled at when we see them. Regardless of where you sit, whether you're leaning left or leaning right, or you're more in the middle, or you're just completely somewhere, all completely off the page, all by yourself, there should be certain things as followers of Jesus that when we see them, they should be unsettling for us. And so the law of Christ should inform our conscience. And then we add to that conscience this wisdom and knowledge. We're not afraid of gaining information. We're not afraid of science. We're not afraid of discoveries in medicine and all these different things. We add knowledge to that, and from there, we make our informed decisions. We make those informed decisions so that we know who we're going to vote for, how we're going to lean politically. And that's where disagreement's going to happen, but it's okay that disagreements happen there as long as we don't allow it to divide us. Because again, the goal for this series, disagree politically, love unconditionally, and pray for unity. That is what we're after. And the question that we're answering, the question that we're trying to get to the bottom, the question that you're going to have to continue to wrestle to the ground even long after this series is over, is can I put my faith filter ahead of my political filter? Can we put our faith filter ahead of our political filter? Now, mentioned earlier, Paul, in a letter to a group of Jesus followers in Galatia, introduced this idea of the law of Christ. And he did it in a really interesting way. In Galatians chapter 2, he said this: carry one another's burdens. Carry one another's burdens. Now, what does that even mean, to carry one another's burdens? Well, one, it means that I have to get in proximity to you, right? It means that I have to care about the things that are burdening you down. And something incredible happens when I do that. See, when I carry someone else's burdens, what divides us diminishes. The thing that separates us, the thing that causes division amongst us, when I lean in and I carry your burden, or when you lean in and you carry my burden, the thing that divides us diminishes. And what unites us surfaces. What unites us, what makes us as one, kind of rises to the top. This is something that the early church was really good at. And for many of us in the room and many of us watching online, maybe this feels like this is something we're really good at too. Like we've done a really good job of loving people unconditionally, even when we disagree politically. Maybe that's the case. You look at yourself and you're being really just completely open-minded and saying, if there's really something going on in my life, I want to be able to see it. But after you thoroughly investigate yourself and your motives and your intention, you're like, you know what? I feel like I'm pretty good at loving people, even if we disagree. I feel like I'm pretty good at accepting people, even if we don't see things eye to eye. That's awesome. But I want to ask you to look a little bit differently. I want to ask you to look a little bit further than that. I want to ask you to really kind of evaluate specifically with the context of this idea of this bias that we have towards attributing people's character with their actions. And specifically, in the political scope, I want to ask you to look and answer the question, am I a party person first, or am I a kingdom person first? Am I a party person first, or am I a kingdom person first? Here's the reality that we don't want to look at sometimes. Even as followers of Jesus, we can get caught up in saying, well, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and that's who I am, and that's who I'm going to support, and it doesn't matter what happens, that's who I'm supporting. And I'm not telling you who to support or who to vote for. But I can remember back in the 2016 election, and I'm sure you heard this too. I read this, I heard this all over the place. You know what we have to do? We just have to pick the lesser of two evils. Maybe you even said that. And I understand. And as long as human beings are involved, there will never be a perfect, unflawed candidate. And there will never be a perfect, unflawed party. As long as there's flesh and blood involved, there's going to be flaw, there's going to be imperfection. I get that. And I even understand the idea of voting for the lesser of two evils. I totally get that. Here's where the problem shows up. We become party people when we refuse to call out the evil that is within the party. If we're so focused on, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat or I'm here or I'm there, and we refuse to acknowledge the evil that is there, we refuse to acknowledge the imperfection that is there, then we've become party people before kingdom people. Why are you talking about this stuff, Heath? What does this have to do with bringing unity? It sounds to me like you're trying to bring division. See, the early church, they didn't buy into the lie that, I have to be a straight line, follow this, and be, these are my people and I have to follow them, or this is my people and I have to follow them. In fact, there were people in the early church who lost their lives over this because they didn't give full-fledged support, unconditional support to any emperor, even the good ones. When there was something bad that was going on, they weren't afraid to call it out, and it cost them their lives. And they instituted what we're going to call this morning culturally disruptive unity. They had this culturally disruptive unity that they were not willing to look at an emperor who was in charge and say, you know what, this guy's been good to us, and so I'm just gonna follow blindly where he goes. Or this emperor has been bad for us, and so I'm gonna just follow blindly in the opposite direction. They didn't do those things. They called imperfections out when they were there. They were willing to put their neck on the line and put their name by it and say, you know what? There's imperfections here. And we have one king, and he's Jesus. He isn't some emperor. He isn't some political hierarchy, political power. Our king is Jesus. It cost a lot of them their lives, but they were unified. They were unified around this idea that we're going to follow Jesus first. And the reason was simple. It was easy to see. It was easy to understand. Because the message of Jesus was that I showed up on the scene to create a new kingdom, and everyone's invited. Everyone is invited to come in and be a part. I'm not excluding anyone. Everyone can come into the kingdom. And this kingdom isn't a normal kingdom where you're going to come and you're going to give your life for me. No, I'm going to flip it upside down and I'm going to give my life for you. I'm going to give my life for everyone here. And that was the king that they followed. And it was culturally disruptive because in ancient Rome, power was the king. Power and control and territory, those were the most important pieces. And so Rome couldn't understand what was going on. They had no clue. They couldn't name what was going on with this little group of Jesus followers. They couldn't understand how they were so united and they were willing to even give up their lives to follow this crucified rabbi. And Paul comes along in this letter to the Galatian church, and he turns it even more on its ear. He says this in Galatians chapter 3. There's neither Jew nor Gentile in this new kingdom, which was earth-shattering. Because for hundreds of years, thousands of years, there had been a distinction. Either you're a Jew or you're not. And we don't play well with one another. If you were Jewish and I was a Gentile, then our children couldn't marry. You couldn't come in my house. I couldn't come in your house. You couldn't eat the food that I eat. I couldn't eat the food that you eat. We just don't connect. Our paths wouldn't cross. But he didn't stop there. He said, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. Then he says, neither slave nor free. Now, when we think slave, it's not like the slavery that was in the United States. In Rome, anybody could be a slave. In Rome, it didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter the color of your skin or your ethnicity. Anyone at any time could become a slave because here's how it could happen. If your house payment was due and you didn't have the money to pay, then they're going to come and take your house, and they're going to take one of your children or take you as a slave until that debt has been paid. In Rome, this idea was there were going to be those who were ruling and those who were to be ruled. But Paul comes along and writes, no. There's not Jew or Gentile, and there's not slave or free. And then this next thing that he says is even more disturbing. There's neither male nor female. There is neither male nor female. And in this particular culture, at this particular time, women had less right. They were viewed lower than slaves. They had no authority. They had no voice. They couldn't earn a living. That's why and forgive me for saying this, it's strange to me that every woman wouldn't at least consider following Jesus because of the dignity that he brought to women. It blows my mind that there would be women who would say, I'm not interested in following Jesus, just for the sheer fact, whether you believe it or not, just for the sheer fact that he gave dignity where there was no dignity. He spoke truth and life where there was nothing to be spoken to because women were just not considered anything. But Paul says there's neither Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. And then he ends it up with this. He says, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. This new upside down kingdom, there is unity and there's no distinction any longer. It's not us versus them. We're all one together. And it was culturally disruptive unity in the body of Christ. And the early church used this to take the message of the gospel further. They used this to grow and flourish in an area and in a time when they shouldn't have, and when it was dangerous. Some 45 years after Paul was executed in Nero's Rome, there was a new emperor in town, Emperor Trajan. And Emperor Trajan sent out an edict. He said, I want Christianity stopped. It is growing too fast. It is making too big of a difference. It is changing everything that we know about our nation and our culture, and I want it changed. I want it stopped. So he sent out this edict to all of the different provinces that Rome had control of. One of the governors who received this edict was a guy named Pliny the Younger, not to be confused with Pliny the Older. So this was the younger. And he ruled over this area that we would consider modern-day Turkey. So it kind of gives you an idea of maybe where his area was at. He was in modern-day Turkey. He sent this edict. He said, I want you to round up Christians, and I want you to squash what they're doing, because the gods are angry. And the gods are angry because we're not sacrificing to them the way that we used to any longer. And the reason that's not happening is because Christianity is taking over. And so I want you to stop it. And so in his edict, he declared that Christians should be gathered up, should be tortured, and should be forced to sacrifice and offer their allegiance to, bow allegiance to the emperor. Pliny the Younger, he followed his instructions, but he didn't really understand why. And so he did a little bit of investigating. He decided he wanted to know why he was taking such a drastic approach towards these Christians in the first place. And so he gathered in a group of Christians. He beat them up a little bit, and he questioned them. He said, tell us what you're doing. Tell us what's going on. Why is the emperor wanting to wipe you out? And then he wrote a letter back to Emperor Trajan. And fortunately for you and for me, it survived antiquity, and so we can read some of what he discovered. Here's what he discovered as he gathered up this group of Jesus followers and tried to figure out why they were such terrible people in the Roman Empire. He says, the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn. Like the sum total of their problem is that they were gathering together one day before dawn, and they were crossing socioeconomic lines, they were crossing ethnic lines, they were crossing political lines, they were crossing slave and master lines, and they were just coming together. Now, let me just ask, if we decide next Sunday we're going to change service to Monday morning at 6 a.m., how many folks are going to show up? I'll be honest with you, it'll be hard for me to walk across the parking lot, and I live right there, okay? Now, I know a couple of people who would be here. I'm not going to call their names, Thor, but they would be here. I give him a hard time because he's such an early bird. He's super, super early everywhere, and I love that about him. It's just fantastic. Chances are most of us wouldn't show up if it was a 6 a.m. on a Monday morning for worship. But that's what the equivalent of was for these guys. They were coming before dawn on a work day because there was no weekend, there was no Sunday for them to just chill at home. So the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet together, and then they came and no, you can go to the next one, you're good. And then sing responsively a hymn to Christ as God. The horror, these horrific people were meeting together before dawn, and they were singing a hymn to Christ as God. We need to get rid of them all. But he continues. And to bind themselves by an oath, and here's the problem. Here's where the issue comes in. They bound themselves together by an oath. Not to a crime, not to do something illegal, not to do something that was going to hurt someone else or damage someone else, but not to commit fraud or theft or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. Essentially, Pliny the Younger discovered that these Jesus followers, they were some of the best people in the region. Like, they were the ones who decided, I'm not going to do anything that's going to hurt you. I'm not going to do anything that's going to negatively impact you. And when you count on me and I give you my word, I'm going to be there. They were the ones who were radically changing the Roman civilization as Rome knew it. And it wasn't with military power. It wasn't with force. It was this culturally disruptive unity where they said, I'm going to love you the way that God through Christ has loved me. It's almost as if they believed that how they interacted with another person was a reflection of their relationship with God. How they cared for one another was a direct correlation to how they followed Jesus. And can I tell you, the same thing is true for you and me today. How we one another matters. How we love one another, even in the midst of disagreement, matters. Jordan Peterson, in a book that he wrote, I think he summed it up really brilliantly. Here's a quote that he had. He said, Christianity achieved the well-nigh impossible. The Christian doctrine elevated the individual soul. It made an individual important. It elevated the individual soul, placing slave and master and commoner and nobleman alike on the same metaphysical footing, rendering them equal before God and the law. And then he concludes it with this: the implicit, transcendent worth of each and every soul established itself against impossible odds. This Jesus-following cult that they called it, this Nazarene sect that they considered it, should have died off with the death of Jesus, but it didn't. It continued. And it didn't just continue, it thrived. And it didn't just thrive, it shaped the Western world. And it did so not because they had military power. It did so not because they had all the money. It did so not because they elected the right person. It did so because they were committed to loving unconditionally, disagreeing, praying for unity. It happened because they were willing to say, you are more important to me than my view. It had everything to do with the fact that they looked at one another as equals at the foot of the cross, because here's the reality. They all came to faith in Jesus the same way. They all were saved the same way through the shed blood of Jesus. And whether they had a lot or they had a little, or they were somewhere in the middle, they were on equal terms at the foot of the cross. And as followers of Jesus, you and I are a part of that movement. As followers of Jesus, you and I are a part of that same story. That's why it's so foolish for any church, any group of Jesus followers to be divided. Yes, we may disagree. Some of my best friends in the world, people that I love like family, we disagree on a lot of things. Politics isn't just one of them. There are many things we disagree on. But they're still my brothers. They're still my family. I love them. And it's okay that we don't agree as long as we don't let that divide us. Paul in Galatians 6:2. Carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Get in close proximity, metaphorically speaking, with the pandemic going on. But get in close proximity to people who are nothing like you, and people who disagree with you, and care about them, and carry their burdens. Because when we get close to people and we carry one another's burdens, we get insight into who they are, where they sit, so that we'll understand where they stand. At the end of the day, that's what we're called to do, to carry one another's burdens so that we can fulfill the law of Christ. Now, this series, as I said in the beginning, our goal has been to disagree politically, love unconditionally, and pray for unity. So let's do that. Let's do that. Once upon a time, a group of Jesus followers changed the world because they were unified. And I'm just crazy enough to think that Jesus can do it again. If there's a group of people who are willing to come together and lock arms and say, you know what, I may not agree with everything that you agree with. We may not see everything eye to eye from a political perspective, but you know what? You're my brother, you're my sister. I love you, and let's do this together. Jesus is more important than my political affiliation. And if we do that, if we're successful at doing that, then maybe, just maybe, we can leave the world in a little bit better place than we found it. And maybe that phrase that is woven into the fabric of the United States of America, that we are one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Maybe that'll ring true again. Or maybe that'll ring true for the very first time. Father, in this room and watching online, there are people with different belief systems, different ideologies, different philosophies, different thoughts. And that's okay. You didn't create us so that we would all be exactly the same and we would all see everything exactly the same. But you did call us to unity. It was the thing that you prayed for before your death and resurrection. And so, Father, I pray that you, God, you would speak to our hearts. You would speak to our minds. You would speak to our spirits. God, we would recognize the areas where we've created space and we've created gaps and we've created distance. God, where we've had this fundamental attribution error where well, they're all this way or they're all that way. God, I pray that you would just speak to us into our hearts and our spirits and our minds, and that we would just crash all of that away. God, you would strip it all away. You would bring it crashing down. And that you would let a culturally disruptive unity amongst the followers of Jesus to take precedent again. Father, I pray where we disagree, that we can still love and we can still be one. Because that's what you ask us to do. It's what you prayed for. It's what you expect of us. God, would you just move in our hearts this morning? In Jesus' name.